Friends, before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss a new audiobook, and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you in advance. Cinderella. The fire beneath the glass. The kingdom of Viridia was built on a foundation of ashes and carefully tended lies. It was a place where the rain fell gray, washing soot from elegant spires only to have it settle again by dusk. Magic, the old wild kind that sang in the blood and bloomed from the earth, was the greatest lie of all. It was forbidden, a heresy punishable by a pyre that smelled of charred dreams. The nobles, of course, did not truly believe this. They merely hid their power, hoarding it like jewels in velvet-lined boxes, while the commoners bled for the slightest whisper of it. In a manor house on the outskirts of the capital, a different kind of bleeding took place. Here they called her Ella, not out of affection but for the simplicity of it. A short, sharp name for a girl who was meant to be insignificant. She was not meek, this girl with eyes the color of banked embers. She was a fortress of suppressed will. Her stepmother, Lady Tremaine, was a woman carved from ice and ambition. She saw not a person in Ella, but a vessel, a hollow, silent thing, perfect for storing the forbidden, corrosive spells Tremaine dared not keep within her own flesh. Tonight, the vessel was full to bursting. Ella knelt on the cold stone floor of the scullery, her raw hands submerged in water that stank of lye. Every muscle ached with a phantom weight, the residue of the containment spell Tremaine had forced into her at dawn. It felt like shards of obsidian moving sluggishly in her veins, a dark, heavy poison that smothered the strange warmth that sometimes flickered within her, a warmth she had been taught since childhood to fear and conceal. "The fire is a sin, Alora," her true mother had whispered to her years ago in the last moments of her life. "It is a beautiful, damned sin. You must never let them see it." Alora, her true name, a name spoken only in the silence of her own heart. She finished her work as the moon, a pale, sickly sliver, rose over the ash-choked woods. The house slept, or pretended to. Silence in Tremaine's domain was a performance. Ella moved like a ghost through the darkened halls, her feet finding the familiar path to the abandoned West Wing, her only sanctuary. Here the dust was a comfort. It was a blanket of neglect, proof that Lady Tremaine's influence had its limits. It was in this wing that she found the mirror. It was hidden beneath a moth-eaten sheet, its gilded frame tarnished black. She had passed it 100 times, but tonight a compulsion drew her near. The air around it hummed, a low thrum that resonated with the hidden warmth beneath her skin. She pulled the sheet away. The glass did not show her reflection. It showed a swirling silver mist. "Alora." The voice was not a sound. It was a feeling. It was the memory of sunlight on her face, the scent of rain-soaked earth, the feeling of her mother's hand on her brow. It was a voice woven from starlight and loss. Ella stumbled back, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Who's there?" "Do not be afraid, child of cinders. I have been waiting for you to find your way back." "My mother called me that," Ella whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" "I am the echo of a promise, the one you called your godmother. I am trapped here between the world of breath and the world of bone." The mist in the mirror pulsed with a soft, melancholic light. "I have watched you. I have felt you carry their foul magic inside you, a casket for their sins. It is killing you, my dear. Slowly, a little more each day." Tears she had refused to shed for years pricked at Ella's eyes. The truth of the words was a physical blow. "I have no choice. There is always a choice. The voice grew firmer, warmer, like a hearth fire being stoked. You can remain a slave, a vessel for their fear, or you can awaken the fire beneath your skin. The fire that is your birthright. The fire is a sin, Ella recited, the old fear a cold knot in her stomach. No, the voice whispered, fierce and loving. It is a sacrament. It is the first light in the darkness, the spark that gave life to this world before the kings and their lies buried it in ash. They fear it because they cannot control it. They fear it because it is the truth, and truth is the most dangerous magic of all. Ella pressed a hand to her own chest, feeling the dull, trapped ache of Tremaine's spell. Beneath it, like a distant sun, she felt her own warmth. Her fire. For the first time, she did not try to suppress it. She listened to its quiet, persistent song. "What must I do?" she asked, her voice no longer a whisper but a vow. "The prince holds a ball," the voice said. "A spectacle to find a bride and distract the court from the rot in its heart. You will go. I cannot. I have nothing to wear. No way to get there." "You have me," the mirror replied, "and you have the fire. We will fashion you a dress not of silk, but of remembrance and rage, of glass and flame. You will not go as a hopeful girl. You will arrive as a storm. You will show them the cinder girl is gone. You will show them the queen you were born to be." The mist in the mirror coalesced, and for a fleeting second Ella saw a face, kind eyes, a smile lined with wisdom, a crown of woven starlight. Her godmother, her guide. "And the prince?" Ella asked. "Prince Raylan bears a curse of his own, a magic of truth, forced upon his bloodline to root out deception. It is a lonely, painful power. He sees the lies in everyone. He has never seen a truth that did not wound him." The voice softened. "Until now. Your fire is the one truth he cannot turn from. It will call to him, and his truth will call to you. It will be a conflagration." Ella looked at her hands, still chapped and red from servitude. She imagined them not stained with lie, but glowing with embers. She imagined walking into that glittering palace not to be chosen, but to choose. She looked back into the mirror, into the eyes of her destiny. Then let the storm come. The days that followed were a strange, suspended dream. Ella moved through her duties like an automaton, her body scrubbing floors and mending linens while her spirit was elsewhere, conversing with the silver mist in the mirror. The voice of her godmother, whose name was Lyra, became the secret rhythm of her heart, a counterpoint to the dissonant chords of Lady Tremaine's spells. Each night, in the profound silence of the witching hour, the true work began. It was not the magic of fairy tales, all sparkling wands and instant transformation. It was alchemy. It was soul work. "The most powerful magic is not conjured, Kalara," Lyra's voice whispered in her mind, using the old tongue word for ember heart. "It is remembered. It is invited. You must reach into the heart of the world and call your fire home." Ella stood barefoot on the cold stones of the abandoned wing, her eyes closed. She focused on the weight of Tremaine's containment spell, a black sludge in her veins. Then she reached for the warmth beneath it. "Do not fight the darkness," Lyra guided, her voice a steady beacon. "It is only a shadow, and a shadow cannot exist without a light to cast it. Acknowledge it. Then let it fuel your own flame." Ella breathed in, and imagined drawing the very air of the room into the core of her being. She felt the shards of obsidian magic, the heavy lies, and instead of trying to expel them, she let them sink into the well of her own power. They touched the dormant ember at her center. There was a spark. A gasp tore from her lips. It was not pain but a shocking, vibrant sensation of life. A thread of golden heat unspooled from her core, winding through her limbs, melting the icy residue of the foreign spell. It felt like waking up after a long frozen sleep. For the first time, the warmth in her was not a secret shame, but a triumphant, singing joy. "Good," Lyra murmured, her satisfaction a tangible warmth in the air. "Now for the raiment. A queen does not wear borrowed silk. She wears her own truth." On the eve of the ball, the components were gathered. Not pumpkins and mice, but symbols of her own life. A shard of the windowpane her mother had loved to look through, now clouded with grime. A handful of ashes from the hearth she'd knelt before for 1,000 nights. A tangle of silver thread from her mother's old, discarded sewing box. And her own fire newly awakened, a living, breathing force in her palms. She worked under the moon's approving gaze. She held the shard of glass, and with a thought, her fire licked over it, not to melt but to transform. It shimmered, becoming liquid light, then solid again, now as clear and strong as diamond. She wove the silver thread through it, her fingers moving with an instinct she didn't know she possessed, the thread hardening into delicate, unbreakable chains of starlight. She took the ashes, the evidence of her servitude, and cast them into the air before her. With a whispered word, her fire caught them, but instead of consuming them, it spun them into a fabric darker than midnight, shot through with faint, glowing cinders that pulsed like a slow, steady heartbeat. It was a gown of shadows and remembered fire. When it was done, she stood before the mirror, breathless. The woman who looked back was a stranger, a goddess forged in a forgotten wing. The gown clung to her form, a cascade of living night, the cinders within it shimmering with every slight movement she made. Over it, a lattice of glass and solidified light traced the lines of her body, catching the moonlight and fracturing it into 1,000 rainbows. Her hair, usually tied back in a simple braid, fell in a cascade of waves around her shoulders, and within its chestnut depths tiny, woven threads of glass sparkled like captured stars. On her feet, slippers fashioned from the same enchanted glass, so clear they were almost invisible, yet they felt as light as air. She was not beautiful in the way of court ladies. She was formidable. She was a walking constellation, a creature of myth and ember. "You see," Lyra's voice was thick with emotion, "you were never a cinder girl. You were a phoenix waiting in the ashes." The journey to the palace was not in a carriage, but on a path of her own making. The very air parted for her, the world bending to the will of her focused desire. One moment she was in the dust-choked wing, the next she was standing at the periphery of the royal plaza, the immense obsidian spires of the palace clawing at the sky before her. The ball was a riot of false color and forced laughter. The nobles of Viridia moved in a glittering masquerade, their faces masks of painted contentment, their jewels reflecting a light that came from no sun or moon, but from cold, enchanted stones. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and desperation. Prince Raylan stood on a dais at the far end of the hall, a statue of impeccable boredom. He was handsome, yes, with hair the color of winter wheat and a jawline that could cut glass. But his eyes, a startling, piercing blue, were the true story. They scanned the crowd, and with every passing noble, every simpering debutante, a flicker of profound weariness crossed his face. He saw them. He saw the greed behind the smiles, the ambition behind the fluttering lashes, the intricate webs of lies they told themselves and each other. His truth sense was a constant, grating noise in his soul, a symphony of deceit. And then the music faltered. The great doors had not opened, yet a figure stood in the entrance. She had simply appeared, as if formed from the shadows themselves. The murmurs died. The laughter stilled. All eyes turned to her. Ella. She did not step into the light. She brought her own. The cinders in her gown glowed brighter, casting a warm, intimate radiance around her. The glass latticework blazed, a net of captured lightning. She was a fragment of a wild, untamed world that had no place in this polished tomb. Prince Raylan's breath caught in his throat. The constant, dull roar of falsehoods in his mind ceased. For the first time in his life there was only silence. And in that silence a single pure, overwhelming truth. Fire. He watched her mesmerized as she descended the shallow steps into the hall. The crowd parted for her, not out of courtesy, but out of instinctual awe. He could feel the heat from her from across the room. Not a physical temperature, but a warmth of spirit, an authenticity so potent it was like a physical force. His duty, his father's expectations, the cursed throne he was bound to, it all crumbled to ash in his mind. He moved without conscious thought, stepping down from the dais, his gaze locked with hers. The world narrowed to the space between them. The music started again, a slow, haunting melody, as he came to a stop before her. He was close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, to feel the radiant energy that pulsed from her skin. He did not bow. He simply looked at her, his truth sense stretching out, not to find a lie, but to bask in the glorious, terrifying reality of her. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for her. Ella met his gaze, her own heart thundering. She saw not a prince, but a man burdened by a crown of thorns he had never asked for. She saw the loneliness in his brilliant blue eyes, a reflection of her own. "I am no one of consequence," she said, the words a rehearsed line, but her voice, laced with the power of her fire, made them a challenge. A faint, genuine smile touched his lips, the first real smile he had offered all night. "That," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur, "is the first untruth I have heard all evening, and I find I do not mind it at all." He offered his hand. It was not a command from a prince, but a question, a plea. The air between their almost touching fingers crackled. It was the tension of a spark about to catch dry tinder. It was the breath before a storm. Every instinct told her to flee. Every ounce of her newfound power told her to stay. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. The contact was not a touch. It was a collision of worlds, a silent, cataclysmic event. His truth met her fire, and for a single suspended heartbeat, they were not prince and mystery, but two halves of a long-lost whole, finally, impossibly found. The moment their hands met, the world dissolved into a single blinding point of connection. For Raylan, it was like plunging into a sun-warmed sea after a lifetime of Arctic cold. The constant grating static of half-truths and hidden agendas that had been the soundtrack to his existence was simply gone. In its place was a roaring, vibrant silence, filled only with the thrum of her pulse against his palm and the radiant, unshakable truth of her. It was not a collection of facts or a history he could read. It was her essence. It was resilience forged in fire, a will tempered like steel, and a sorrow so deep it had become a well of strength. He felt the echo of her loneliness, a mirror to his own, and the fierce, guarded ember of her power. It was the most real thing he had ever experienced. For Ella it was an unveiling. The touch of his skin, cool against her own feverish warmth, was a key turning in a lock deep within her soul. She felt his magic, not as an attack but as an inquiry, a gentle, relentless light that sought not to judge but to see. And in that seeing she felt truly visible for the first time. She saw the weight of his crown not as a symbol of power, but as a prison of duty. She felt the isolation of a man who could never be lied to, and therefore could never truly be trusted. His truth was not a weapon. It was a shield, and it was desperately heavy. He did not lead her to the dance floor so much as they were drawn there together, a new gravity pulling them into the center of the room. The other couples were mere ghosts, shimmering at the edges of their perception. The music, a slow, yearning waltz, seemed to emanate from the space between their bodies. His hand settled on the small of her back, a point of contact that sent a shockwave of sensation through the glass-latticed gown. Through the fabric he didn't feel the cold of the glass, but the living warmth of the woman beneath, a heat that pulsed in time with the cinders woven into her skirt. Her other hand rested on his shoulder, and she could feel the tension in the muscle, the strength held in careful check. They began to move. It was not a dance of steps, but of breath and magnetism. They swayed, a slow, intimate orbit. His eyes, that piercing blue, never left hers, and in their depths, she saw the reflection of her own fiery gown, her own transformed self. He was not looking at a disguise. He was seeing through to the core of her. "They see a mystery," he murmured, his voice a low thrum that vibrated through her. "A fascinating new prize. But they are blind." "And what do you see?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the words tasting of smoke and daring. "I see a forge," he said, his gaze intense, unwavering. "I see a heart that has been hammered on the anvil of cruelty, but has refused to break. I see embers in the dark." He leaned infinitesimally closer, his breath a ghost against her cheek. "I see the only real thing in this entire hall of painted masks." Every word was a brand, searing itself into her soul. This was more intimate than any kiss could ever be. He was speaking the truth of her, the truth she had only just begun to acknowledge herself. Her magic stirred in response, a warm golden tide rising within her. The cinders in her dress brightened, casting their small private pool of light around them. "And I see a man who wears a crown of thorns," she replied, her own power lending her a courage she didn't know she possessed. "A man who has heard every lie in the kingdom, but has never been offered a truth that could set him free." Raylan's breath hitched. No one had ever seen that. No one had ever dared. His truth sense had always been a barrier, a wall that kept him separate, untouchable. But her words, they didn't just bypass the wall, they made it irrelevant. She offered a truth that was not a weapon but a bridge. His hand tightened on hers. "What truth is that?" "That you are not alone." The words hung in the air between them, a spell more potent than any Lady Tremaine could conjure. The distance between their faces dwindled. The sounds of the ball, the music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, faded into a distant hum. The world was his breath mingling with hers, the solid warmth of his chest mere inches from hers, the dizzying sensation of falling into the blue oceans of his eyes. He was going to kiss her. She could see the intention in the slight parting of his lips, in the way his gaze dropped to her mouth, and every fiber of her being yearned for it, for the confluence of his truth and her fire, for the sealing of this impossible electric connection. But a clock somewhere in the highest tower began to chime the hour. Midnight. The sound was a physical blow. It was the voice of her old life, a cold reminder of the spells that bound her, of the vessel that awaited its poison. The magic Lyra had woven was potent, but it was tethered to the witching hour. She felt the first subtle tremor of its unraveling. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the warmth he had kindled in her. She pulled back, her eyes wide with a sudden desperate fear. "I have to go," she breathed, the words tearing from her throat. "No," Raylan said, his voice raw, his grip on her hand tightening. "Wait. Tell me your name. Please." But she was already pulling away, the spell of the night shattering around her. The warmth was receding, the cinders in her dress dimming. She turned and fled, not as a queen, but as a woman chased by time itself. He stood frozen for a second, the space where she had been now a cold, aching void. The noise of the court rushed back in, a cacophony of falsehoods that made him wince. But then he saw it. A single perfect slipper, made of what looked like clear, solid light, lying on the marble floor where she had stood. He knelt, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't pick it up. He simply stared at it, a tangible piece of the dream that had just vanished. It was not glass as he knew it. It was magic. Her magic. And as his fingers hovered over it, his truth sense, now a lonely, aching thing once more, whispered a single devastating certainty. This is not a game. This is a revolution. And you have just joined her side. The magic did not simply vanish at the final chime of midnight. It fractured. Ella felt it like a pane of glass shattering inside her chest. The gown of shadows and cinders dissolved into a swirl of cold ash around her ankles, the delicate lattice of glass and light evaporating into mist. The world lurched, the opulent ballroom blurring into the dark, skeletal trees of the woods bordering her home. She stumbled, the momentum of her flight throwing her to her knees on the frozen ground. Only one slipper remained. The other was lost. A piece of her soul left behind on the cold palace marble. The walk back to the manor was a funeral procession of one. The cold seeped through her thin shift, but it was nothing compared to the ice forming in her heart. The memory of his touch, his voice, the devastating clarity in his eyes, it was a brand on her spirit. It felt more real than the rough bark of the tree she leaned against, gasping for breath. But it was a dream, and this, the looming silhouette of Tremaine's house, the scent of lie and despair, was her reality. She slipped inside, a ghost returning to its tomb. The silence was a predator waiting. She made it to the top of the stairs, her hand on the latch of her attic room, when a voice smooth as oiled silk cut through the dark. "Did you enjoy the ball, my dear?" Lady Tremaine stood at the end of the hall, a candle in her hand, its flame casting dancing, monstrous shadows across her sharp features. She was not dressed for sleep. She was waiting. Ella froze, her heart a trapped bird beating against her ribs. Tremaine's eyes, like chips of flint, swept over her, taking in the simple shift, the wild hair, the single inexplicable glass slipper on her foot. A slow, cruel smile stretched her lips. "I felt it, you know. A tremor in the spells I placed within you. A rebellion. I thought one of my own enchantments had turned volatile. But it was you." She took a step closer. "You dared to use what is mine. You dared to touch a power you were born to serve, not to command." "It is not yours," Ella whispered, the words a defiance fueled by the lingering embers of the night. Tremaine's smile vanished. "Everything in this house is mine. The walls, the air, you." She raised her hand, and the air grew thick, heavy with the promise of pain. You are a vessel, Alora. Nothing more. And it is time you were reminded of your purpose. The containment spell slammed into Ella with the force of a physical blow. It was not the slow, insidious poison of before. This was a torrent of pure, malevolent energy, designed to scour her clean, to crush the fledgling fire she had so recently awakened. It felt like being filled with frozen black tar, suffocating the light, smothering the memory of Raylan's touch, of Lyra's voice. Ella cried out, falling to her knees. The world swam in a haze of agony. She clutched the wooden floorboards, her knuckles white, fighting to hold on to a single shimmering memory. The look in his eyes when he saw her. Not as a vessel, but as a forge. You are not alone. The words were a spark in the overwhelming darkness. Deep within, beneath the crushing weight of Tremaine's magic, her own fire flickered in response. It was weak, guttering, but it was hers. She clung to it, a drowning woman to a lifeline. In the palace, Dawn found Prince Raylan still in the grand hall, standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows. The rising sun painted the ash-stained sky in hues of blood and rose. In his hand he held the glass slipper. It was cool to the touch, yet his truth sense hummed against his palm, a constant, low-level confirmation of its profound reality. His captain of the guard, a pragmatic man named Kalen, stood a respectful distance away. The scouts have found nothing, Your Highness. No trace of her departure. It's as if she vanished into the air itself. She didn't vanish, Raylan said, his voice rough from a sleepless night. He turned the slipper over, watching how the nascent light caught its impossible facets. She was pulled away. His truth sense, now a lonely, aching compass, had been screaming a single fact all night. Her flight had been born of fear, not of caprice. He looked out at his kingdom, at the gray expanse of the capital. For the first time, the sight filled him not with a sense of duty, but with a burning, possessive fury. Something had put that fear in her eyes. Someone had forced the most real creature he had ever encountered to flee back into the shadows. "Assemble the court heralds," Raylan commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And send for the royal inquisitor." Kalen stiffened. "The inquisitor, sire? That is a severe measure. The people will talk." "Let them," Raylan said, his gaze hardening. The weary prince was gone, replaced by a king in the making. They will say the prince has been enchanted. They will say he has lost his mind. They do not understand. I have not lost my mind. I have found it. He held up the slipper, its clarity a stark contrast to the murky world outside. "This is not a trinket from a romance. This is a standard of rebellion. And I will scour every house in Viridia. I will tear down every lie, until I find the woman it belongs to." The decree was issued before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. It was not a request. It was a royal command. Every unmarried woman of eligible age in the capital and its surrounding lands was to present herself to the prince, to be tested with the slipper. The inquisitor's presence in the retinue made the true purpose chillingly clear. This was not just a search for a bride. It was a hunt for forbidden magic. The news, carried by swift riders, reached the Tremaine manor by midday. A frantic energy took hold. Lady Tremaine's two daughters, Chrysantha and Drusilla, were thrown into a frenzy of preparation, their shrill voices echoing through the house as they argued over gowns and cosmetics. The prince was coming. Here. In the attic, curled on her thin pallet, Ella heard the commotion. The weight of Tremaine's spell was a physical chain. making every movement an agony. But the news was a key clicking in a lock. He was searching. He had not forgotten. She dragged herself to the small, grimy window, looking down at the courtyard being prepared for a royal visit. Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, began to kindle alongside the pain. He was coming. But then she saw him. A tall, gaunt figure in stark black robes standing beside the captain of the guard, the royal inquisitor. Her blood ran cold. Lyra's voice was a faint whisper in her mind, strained and distant through the barrier of Tremaine's magic. The slipper is not just a key, Kalara. It is a test. It will not fit a foot that is not its own. But the Inquisitor, he will sense the fire in you the moment he is near. This is a trap as much as it is a search. Ella pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Below, her stepsisters preened, believing a slipper could crown them. They had no idea of the storm that was approaching. A storm of truth. A storm of fire. She looked at her own hands, pale and trembling. The fight was not over. It had only just begun. The royal retinue arrived at the Tremaine Manor not with fanfare, but with the grim efficiency of a storm front. Prince Raylan, clad in stark black and silver, was a blade of focused intensity. His eyes, that piercing blue, scanned the house not with curiosity, but with a hunter's calculation. Beside him, the royal inquisitor, a man named Valerius, was a void in the daylight. His presence sucked the warmth from the air. His own magic, a nullifying force designed to detect and suppress the forbidden. Lady Tremaine received them with a performance of gracious humility, but Raylan's truth sense recoiled at the oily slick of her deceit. He said nothing, his silence more intimidating than any accusation. The farce began in the grand receiving room. Chrysantha, then Drusilla, simpered and preened, their feet crammed and forced toward the slipper held by a stone-faced guard. The clear glass refused to yield, reflecting their twisted, desperate expressions. It was not a matter of size, but of essence. The slipper, a fragment of Ella's manifested power, rejected their falsehood as surely as Raylan's own soul did. "It seems my daughters are not the ones you seek, Your Highness," Tremaine said, her voice a carefully modulated blend of regret and sympathy. "A pity. They so admired the mystery of the lady at the ball." Raylan's gaze remained fixed on the slipper. His truth sense was a tangled knot in this house, choked with layers of deception. But through the noise, a single pure thread pulled at him. A familiar warmth. A remembered fire. It was faint, smothered, but it was here. "Are there no other women in this household?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Tremaine's smile was a razor's edge. "None of any consequence, my prince." It was then that a sound, faint but unmistakable, echoed from the floor above. The slam of a heavy door. A bolt being thrown. Raylan's eyes snapped to the ceiling. The thread of warmth flared, then was choked off. "You lie," he stated, the words flat and final. He didn't wait for permission. He moved, his guards and the Inquisitor falling in behind him, a wave of implacable authority. Tremaine's composure shattered. "Your Highness, I must protest. The upper floors are not." He was already taking the stairs two at a time, his heart hammering a war drum in his chest. The pull was undeniable now, a magnetic force drawing him toward a door at the end of a dusty corridor. He could feel her. She was behind that door, and she was in pain. He didn't knock. He gestured to his guard, who slammed a heavy shoulder against the wood. The lock splintered, the door flying open to reveal a stark attic room. And there she was. Not the storm of glass and flame from the ball, but the source of it. Crouched on the bare floorboards, dressed in a ragged shift, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears. She looked up as they entered, and in her eyes, he saw not fear, but a defiant, desperate fury. The sight of her in such squalor, a jewel trapped in filth, sent a rage so pure through him it stole his breath. But before he could speak, the Inquisitor stepped forward. "There," Valerius hissed, his nullifying aura spreading through the small room like a frost. He pointed a skeletal finger at Ella. "The taint of fire. It festers within her." Raylan moved to stand between the Inquisitor and Ella, his body a shield. "Stand down. Your Highness, she is a practitioner of the forbidden arts. The law is clear." "The law," Raylan interrupted, his voice cracking like a whip, "is mine to interpret." He turned his back on the Inquisitor, his entire world narrowing to the woman on the floor. He knelt, the hardwood biting into his knees, but he felt nothing except the overwhelming need to reach her. He held out the slipper. It began to glow, a soft, internal light, pulsing in time with the ragged rhythm of her breath. "Ella," he whispered, the name a secret he had somehow always known. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She looked from his face, etched with a truth she could no longer deny, to the slipper, a symbol of the power she had been forced to hide. This was the moment, to be saved or to save herself. She lifted her gaze to his, and the fire he remembered, the fire of the forge, rekindled in her eyes. "It is not the slipper that needs to fit me, Raylan," she said, her voice hoarse but clear, ringing with a newfound strength. "It is I who must claim it." She reached out, but not for the slipper. She placed her hand over his that held it. The moment their skin touched, the connection from the ball roared back to life, 100 times more powerful. Her fire, no longer a guttering ember but a raging inferno born of suppression and pain, erupted. It did not burn him. It flowed into him, and his truth, a brilliant, searching light, flowed into her. The Inquisitor cried out, shielding his eyes as a wave of golden heat exploded from them, blowing back the guards and shattering the single attic window. Lady Tremaine, who had arrived at the door, screamed as the containment spell she had placed within Ella shattered like glass, the backlash throwing her against the far wall. Ella rose to her feet, not as a servant, not as a mystery, but as a queen. The ragged shift seemed to transform, not back into the ball gown, but into a simple clean linen that glowed with her inner light. The single slipper on her foot blazed, and its mate, still in Raylan's hand, dissolved into a shower of sparks that flew to her, reforming on her other foot. She was whole. She looked at the stunned Inquisitor, at the cowering form of her stepmother, and finally at Raylan, who was looking at her with an expression of awe and utter vindication. "The magic was never forbidden," Ella declared, her voice echoing with power. "It was forgotten, and I am here to remind you all. She was not rescued. She had arisen, and the kingdom of ashes would never be the same." The air in the attic still hummed with the aftershock of power. Dust motes stirred by the concussive wave of Ella's awakening, danced in the shafts of sunlight now pouring through the shattered window. They were no longer particles of neglect, but golden specks in a coronation light. Lady Tremaine lay slumped in the corridor, unconscious, her carefully constructed world of control and lies broken by the very vessel she had sought to contain. The Royal Inquisitor, Valerius, had staggered back, his nullifying aura completely overwhelmed. He stared at Ella, not with accusation, but with a terrified, reverent fear. He was a man who had spent a lifetime hunting shadows, now confronted with the sun. Raylan rose slowly from his knees, his gaze never leaving Ella's face. He did not see a princess to be won. He saw a sovereign to be recognized. The truth sense that had been his burden was now a chorus, singing a single clear note of rightness. This was not the end of a search. It was the beginning of a reign. "The law is clear, Inquisitor," Raylan said, his voice carrying a new, unshakable authority. He did not look away from Ella as he spoke. "Forbidden magic is that which seeks to harm, control, and deceive. What you witness here is magic that liberates. It reveals. It is the foundation upon which this kingdom was built before it was buried in fear." He finally turned his head, his blue eyes pinning Valerius in place. "Stand down, or you will be standing against the crown." The command was absolute. Valerius, his face ashen, bowed his head and retreated, his power a guttered candle next to their conflagration. Raylan offered his hand to Ella once more. This time it was not a question but an alliance. "They will call it a scandal. They will say I am bewitched." Ella placed her hand in his, the connection a steady, thrumming current of fire and truth. "And what will you say?" A slow, genuine smile, the one she had only seen glimpses of, finally broke across his face. It transformed him from a haunted prince into a king of unshakable conviction. "I will say the truth, that I have found the only person in this kingdom who does not need my crown, but who deserves to share it. That the fire I saw in the ballroom was not an illusion, but the dawn." He led her from the attic, not as a rescued captive but as his equal. They descended the stairs, past the stunned guards and the trembling forms of her stepsisters. They walked out of the Manor of Ashes and into the weak afternoon light. The news traveled faster than a galloping horse. The prince had found his mystery woman, and she was no noble lady, but the Tremaine Cinder Girl, and she was a witch. The capital held its breath, waiting for the pyres to be built, for the royal decree of execution. It never came. Instead, Prince Raylan stood with Ella on the palace balcony, before the gathered, murmuring court and the wary citizens in the plaza below. He held her hand aloft, their intertwined fingers a symbol of the union they proclaimed. "You have been told that magic is a curse." Raylan's voice, amplified by his own power of truth, rang out over the crowd, silencing every whisper. "You have been taught to fear the fire, the earth, the very lifeblood of this world. You have been ruled by lies." He turned to Ella, his gaze full of a trust so profound it stole her breath. "Show them." Ella closed her eyes. She did not reach for the power as something separate. She simply let go of the last chains that bound it. She remembered her mother's love, the sting of Tremaine's cruelty, the solace of Lyra's voice, the searing honesty in Raylan's touch. She remembered it all, and she let her fire answer. It did not erupt in a destructive inferno. It bloomed. From her feet, warmth spread across the cold stone of the balcony, then down the palace walls, flowing into the plaza. Where it touched, the gray, ash-choked stones of the city began to clean themselves, the soot dissolving into nothing. Tiny, brave shoots of green pushed through cracks in the cobblestones, unfurling into blossoms of impossible color. The very air shimmered, clearing of its perennial haze, revealing a sky of brilliant, forgotten blue. It was not an attack. It was a restoration. a remembering. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, then turned into a wave of awe. This was not the dark, fearful magic of whispered legends. This was life magnified. This was beauty reborn. In the silent reflection of the restored palace windows, Ella saw her own image. Not a girl in a servant's dress or a woman in a gown of glass, but a figure of calm, immense power. Her eyes held the wisdom of the ember that survives the long, cold night. She was not beside the throne. She was the throne, a seat of power born not of conquest but of authenticity. That night, in the quiet of his chambers, she stood before the great mirror he had brought from the west wing. The silver mist within it swirled content. "You see, my child," Lyra's voice whispered, filled with a profound peace. "The glass slipper was never a trap. It was an invitation to stand in your truth, no matter how fragile it seems. And when you did, you found it was unbreakable." Ella reached out and touched the cool glass. "I am free." "You are," Lyra agreed. "And so now is he." She turned to find Raylan watching her. His love for her, a truth so bright and unwavering it needed no words. He walked to her and took her hands, his thumbs stroking her palms. "They will write stories about this," he murmured. "They will tell of a prince who searched for a maiden with a glass slipper." Ella smiled, a true, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "And they will have missed the point entirely." She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his, their breath mingling, their magics, truth and fire, weaving together into a single unending tapestry. The slipper was never the prize. It was the key. And the prince wasn't the savior. He was the witness, the one who had the courage to see the queen, and the wisdom to kneel. He kissed her then, and it was the final seal. It was not a kiss of passion alone, but of pact, a promise of a kingdom rebuilt not on ashes and lies, but on the bedrock of their shared truth. And somewhere in every girl who was ever told to wait for a prince, in every heart that had ever been told it was too much, too loud, too fiery, an ember stirred. For the story of Cinderella was never about a rescue. It was a reminder. In every girl who was ever told to wait for a prince, lives a queen who was born to set herself free. And so the ember finds its hearth, and the truth finds its voice. But every story, like a spell, lives on in the breath of those who hear it. If this tale of fire and freedom found a spark within you, then help us keep the magic alive. Subscribe to the channel and become part of our court. You'll be the first to know when the next forbidden tale begins to whisper. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Was it the heat of Ella's transformation, the tension of that first dance, or the moment the glass slipper shattered her chains that captivated you the most? Your words are the kindling for our next story. And if you felt the fire beneath the glass, please give this video a like. It is a signal flare in the dark, a way to tell the algorithm and us that you believe in stories where queens set themselves free. Thank you for listening. Remember, the most powerful magic is a story shared. Until the next adventure begins.